Thank you very much for that introduction, Harvey, and thank you all so much for coming here. I've been here a few times before, and so it's nice to come back. People here ask me before, and people ask myself and other historians that they meet, how do you get the ideas for your books? Do you go to symposiums and discuss these with historians from around the country? Do you go into the deep, dark recesses of libraries and find your ideas there? No. This book, I Am Murdered, fell out of the air and hit me in the head. It did. I was doing research on another book at Rutgers University Library, and I was getting a book off a shelf. I lost my balance. My body sort of fell against the shelf and knocked off a book 3 shelves higher. It fell off the shelf, hit me on the head, almost knocked me over, and fell to the floor with the cover open. And on the cover of it, it said, "The Murder of George Wythe." Now, I knew who George Wythe was, and I said, well, this is interesting. I didn't know he had been murdered. It was a 40-page pamphlet from the early 1950s that had been published. And it was a spark for this book that I did. So book ideas come in many different ways. But if this book turns out well, I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that I get hit in the head a lot. On the morning of Sunday, May 25th, 1806, George Wythe rose just after dawn, as he always did, at his home in Richmond, Virginia, on the top of the hill that overlooked the city, just a few blocks from the State House that his close friend, Thomas Jefferson, had designed. He walked to the back porch of the home and took his morning shower, as he always did. Had a huge container of water. He just pulled a lever, and out it came. Washed up and went back into the house, awaiting breakfast later. Living with him in the house at that time was his freed black woman, maid, Lydia Broadnax, his black protege, Michael Brown, who had been with him for several years, and his grandnephew, George Wythe Sweeny, his sister's grandson. George Wythe Sweeny was sort of the black sheep of the Wythe family. And he lived with Wythe from time to time, from periods ranging from a few weeks to a few months. And Wythe was always trying to get him on the straight and narrow and solve his problems. He was living there in the house, too. Breakfast was being made in a small outbuilding behind the house, because at that time in colonial America, your kitchen was separate from the house, so the kitchen fires didn't burn down the residence. So everybody is out and back making breakfast, and George Wythe is upstairs in his home. Lydia Broadnax is making breakfast of eggs and toast for everybody. George Wythe Sweeny comes in and says hello to everybody. Goes over to the grill where the coffee pot is and is chit-chatting with Lydia and Michael. Pours himself a cup of coffee and leans against the table and begins to drink it and eat some toast that Lydia had made him, talking all the while he's doing this. Then when he finishes his cup, so that everybody there had seen him drink a cup of coffee, he moved back to the stove, took a small piece of white paper, and poured a bunch of finely cut white crystals into the coffee pot. Now Lydia, a few feet away, saw him do this and didn't think anything of it. She had no idea what he had done. Then he told everyone he had to leave right away, he had to go somewhere. He leaves the kitchen. Lydia then pours Michael a cup of coffee, has one for herself, and brings one up to the judge. A few minutes later, Michael Brown gets violently ill after he drinks the coffee. Falls face down on the table in front of him. Lydia becomes so sick that she has to hang on to the counter to prevent from falling to the floor. Both have violent stomach pains. Upstairs, George Wythe is reading his morning newspapers, drinking his coffee, and eating his eggs. And he becomes incredibly sick. He's never felt so sick in his life. He gets out of bed, and he immediately purges himself. Walks a few feet, gains support by leaning against the wall, and purges himself again. Manages to get down the stairs, across the back lawn, to the kitchen. Walks in and sees Lydia and Michael Brown as ill as he is. And he gets scared. He tells Lydia, go somewhere, go to a neighbor's house, and tell him to get a doctor, and get a doctor over here because we have a lot of trouble. She does that. She manages to get a neighbor to get a doctor who comes over. George Wythe is upstairs in his bed, resting. He's purged himself again. He's 80 years old, and he's holding himself up on his elbows and his pillows when the doctor and a neighbor arrive. And he looks up at them, and he says to them in this gravelly voice of his, "I am murdered." Everybody in Richmond, Virginia, hears in the next 2 days that he's very sick. Lydia tells the doctor, the neighbors, 2 more doctors and friends who arrived there that day, the entire story of what she saw. She saw this guy poison him. He poured poison into the coffee pot. Everybody who drank the coffee got sick, except him, because he drank the coffee before he poured the crystals in it. She swore the crystals were arsenic, that they were all going to die. Everybody waited for days to see what would happen to them. A week later, Michael Brown died. Lydia survived, but her eyesight was hurt so badly from the coffee that for the rest of her life she needed special eyeglasses that were paid for, by the way, by President Jefferson. George Wythe lingered for 2 weeks until he finally died. There was a funeral for him that, until that year, 1806, was the largest funeral in the state of Virginia's history. George Washington had been buried privately. Thousands of people went to the funeral to listen to the funeral orations of William Munford, one of Wythe's protégés, who gave a tender, touching, reminiscent talk about Wythe's life, his distinguished life, and then at the end of it, pointed out to the crowd, and without naming him, said that despite all of this, one of Wythe's close associates, in black ingratitude, had murdered him. And this sent ripples of shock through the crowd. George Wythe was one of the most beloved people in the history of the United States. Now, he's not that well known today because he didn't keep his letters or a diary or a journal. So the few books that were written about him didn't have all this information. He's a very well-known figure in Virginia. When he died, he was 80 years old. Now, you've got to remember that in the investigation later, this becomes a factor. What I'm going to do today is explain to you the murder that I already did, the criminal investigation as to who did it, and then I want you to serve as the jury. Think through the whole case, and remember that you can only consider the evidence that is admissible in court and how that evidence balances out with the facts of the case. Then at the end of our talk tonight, I'm going to ask you what your verdict is on the person who was accused of the murder. And then you'll deliver the verdict, and I'll tell you what the actual historic verdict was. Now, why was George Wythe so beloved? At the age of 80, he should have died a long time ago. In that era in America, 3/4 of people died before the age of 50. If you lived into your 60s, you were ancient. You were like Romans and the Greeks in togas. Into your 70s was really incredible, but to reach 80 was remarkable. Wythe was about 5'7", 5'8", sort of the average height for people at that time. Because of age, his body was stooped over a bit, and he walked around Richmond with a cane. His white hair was pulled in back and tied together with a queue. When he got to Richmond, he had founded or joined a number of book clubs, literary societies, and bought up books from a huge bookstore in Richmond, one of the largest in the country. The only person anybody knew in the United States that had more books than George Wythe was his friend Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, of course, had such a large collection of books that when he donated them to Congress, those books became the foundation for the Library of Congress. How did George Wythe become so beloved in Richmond and Williamsburg, where he used to live? What were the qualities that he had and the things that he did in his life that made him such a distinguished gentleman? His family came to America in the middle 1600s and began buying up land and slaves. When Wythe was in his 20s, early 30s, a plantation that his family had owned in Virginia near Williamsburg had 30 slaves and several hundred acres of land. They grew corn, wheat, and other produce there.